Do you like my frame? Hmm, tough crowd. Well, look who's back. So, my last video did way better than I expected. So, before I get into this video, I first want to thank everyone who watched and or commented. I tried responding to all of the comments, but then as the view count kept going up, it got really difficult to get to them all. So, I just want to say that even if I didn't get to respond to you specifically, I did at least do my best to read what everybody wrote because I feel like that's the least I can do when somebody puts in the effort to write something or share a story or their opinion. So thank you so much for everything. I can't explain how much I appreciate it. I also know that my subscribers more than doubled because of that video, and I think that is in large part because of the topic. Because let's face it, ranting is generally more interesting to watch than a regular build video. So even though this isn't usually my genre of content that I make, I promise that I'll do my best to keep my stuff interesting and useful, even when I'm not complaining about anything. So just please bear with me, I'm still learning how to up my YouTube game. I'll get there. But at the end of the last video, I asked if it would be too redundant to make another frame so soon after, and everyone who responded said that they would like to see another one. And I'm happy to oblige, because I still have this picture left that needs to be framed, and I want to show you my go-to method for making these things. If you learn nothing else from my video, at least you'll know what not to do from the mistakes that I end up making, and also you'll know that you can totally make a frame yourself, because if a dum-dum like me can make it, then you definitely can. Okay, that's enough of an intro. Let's get started. I'll show you how I like to make these. So this is my way of making them, not the only way. So feel free to adjust the method as you see fit. As always, I'll be making my frame from scraps because I love using scraps or repurposed or thrown out material, and I'll choose that over buying something new any day. These are leftover strips of walnut from my friend's project, and he let me use whatever I needed because he's awesome. And probably also because he's tired of my excuses for why I'm not making new things, but that's neither here nor there. I chose these two pieces because they were the only ones thick enough to actually be used for what I need, and I'll be needing both of them in order to have enough material for the entire frame. Which brings me to everyone's favorite portion of woodworking, the math. I know this part might feel dull, but it is important because you want to know if you have enough material before you start cutting. Because even when you work with scraps and things that you found for free, you still don't want to waste material if you don't have to, because this stuff can be expensive. So for anyone who is making a frame for the first time and wants to make sure that their math is correct, I will have that at the end of this video. For now, you're just going to have to trust me that I measured out everything correctly. So, for these first couple of steps, I feel like they're not as important to pay attention to because I assume that everyone is going to be starting off from a different point, especially if you're using repurposed wood. So you might have one large piece, in which case you'll have to cut it down into strips, or you might have a bunch of random pieces that you'll have to Frankenstein together. Whatever the case may be, the first step is to get the wood down to the right dimensions that you want the frame to be. This size is entirely up to you and your aesthetic and whatever it is you're going for. You just have to make sure that the depth is big enough so that you can fit in the glaze, the picture, the mat for the picture, and the mechanisms that are going to hold everything together. So the frame can't be too thin. In my case, I decided to make it about 2.5 by 2.5 centimeters, or 1 inch by 1 inch. I measured out the vinyl that I'll be using for the glaze and the masonite that I'll be using for the backing, just to make sure that everything can fit, and I was good to go. After I measured out the length that I needed, it turned out that 3 of the sides could fit on the long piece, and then I just needed long enough from the second piece for that last remaining short edge. Alright, now, no matter how you got to this point, we should all be in the same place. We have our strips of wood that are the right dimensions, and now we have to cut this little lip on the inside that the glass and the picture are going to fit inside. This is called a rabbit. No, not that kind of rabbit. This kind of rabbit. Start by picking a side that you want to be the face of the frame, meaning the side of the frame that will be facing out when you stand in front of your picture. Put that side so it faces out, away from the fence. Then, for my setup, the distance from the fence to the outside of the blade is how much room I think I need for the glass, the picture, the backing, and then all the mechanisms. And this is important. Usually, when we measure out things on the table saw, we measure it from the fence to the inside of the blade, because that is what we're cutting off. But in this case, you want to measure to the outside of it. So for me, I measured about 1.3 centimeters, or half an inch. And then, lastly, I set up the blade so it is the height of how deep I want the glass and the mat to sit inside the frame. Again, this part is going to be in my measurements at the end, so if it doesn't make sense now, it will at the end. Once I have that set up, I run both of my pieces through. What I'm cutting here is called a single rabbit. Like I said before, there are many different approaches to frame making, and one of the other ones uses what it's called a double rabbit. Which one you go with depends on what you're going for with the frame and what mechanisms you plan on using to hold everything in place. Since I'll be using glazier points, a single rabbit works just fine. But if you like to switch out your pictures super frequently, then it might be worth putting in a little extra effort to have something that's easier to put on and off. It all really comes down to preference. Alright, this is what our pieces should look like. And now we have to just cut off this little portion here to create the lip that everything will be sitting on. Back to the table saw we go. Now, you put the side that you want to be the face, and you put it facing up, with that line that we just cut being on the other side of the fence, so facing to the left. The blade is at a height so it reaches that notch that we just cut, and then the distance from the fence to the inside of the blade is enough to reach that notch. So we are back to measuring from the fence to the inside of the blade, like we usually do. And now we just run them all through again like we did last time. And bam! Look at these nice cuts. If any part isn't super clean, you can always clean it up with a chisel because you want your picture to lay in there really nicely. Alright, now that you have these, here's another detail that might seem a little extra, but it'll make the frame look that much nicer. When you're getting ready to cut the piece into the strips for the sides, you want to alternate long side, short side, long side, short side, or the other way around. If you do it this way, the grain will flow way better across the frame because it will look more continuous, going from one side to the other as it wraps around the frame. It's a minor detail, but it does make a huge difference. Even if you don't notice it consciously, it just kind of registers in your subconscious. So that's what I'm going to be doing with my miters. Unfortunately, I have that one short edge that's coming from a different strip of wood, so that one can't blend in as well, but I'll be alternating the rest of them. And then we chop. Make sure that all the sides are the right length, and also make sure that you're cutting your miters in the right direction. Because God knows I didn't. I messed it up last time. I got so excited and I wanted to finish, so I stopped paying attention, and I ended up cutting my miters so that the rabbit was facing the outside of the frame instead of the inside. Yep. I know it sounds like an obvious thing to look out for, but if I avoided all the obvious mistakes, then I wouldn't be able to serve as a cautionary tale that you can learn from. So you know what? You're welcome. I do it for you. After I checked that everything fit, I used my good old bang clamp, and I glued the thing together. This is normally where I would have downtime to sit and relax for a little bit while I wait for the glue to set, but in this case, there are other things that I can make while I wait. The frame still needs a back, so I dug up a scrap piece of masonite. I checked that it was long enough. Got distracted by another cool-looking scrap. Put it away for later in a place where I'll never find it again. And then I went to cut the backing down to size. I guess another pro tip that might help you while you're making this, If this is your first time making a frame and you're unsure of the measurements and if you're cutting everything right, you can always do this part first. If you cut out the back before you start making the actual frame, you can then use it as a size reference throughout your build. It might make it easier to check your work that way so you know if you're going off script or if you're staying true to your measurements. Okay, it's been over an hour now. The glue is set. Let's keep going. As most of you know, gluing end grain doesn't create a strong hold. The glue that I put so far is only really meant to hold this thing until I can reinforce the corners with something stronger. This is where this jig comes in. Now, making this contraption just so you can make a single frame might seem excessive, and if you really needed to just make one frame, then I would agree, it is. But in my opinion, this jig should be one of the staples of any wood shop. Everyone in the shop has used it countless times for countless projects. It takes a bit of upfront effort to make it, but it's a really, really good tool to have, so it is definitely worth it. With this jig, I can put my frame inside it and then cut the notches in the corner on my table saw. You know this part is foolproof because I didn't make any mistakes when I was doing this the first time. Or the second time. After I ran all the 4 corners through, this is what I had. Now, I just grab one of my many scraps and I cut it out to the right width so that I can fit it inside the gap that I just made. And actually, I don't cut it to the exact size. I make it a little bit wider and then I sand it down by hand until it's the thickness that I want. This way, I have a bit more control of how wide I can make it. Another pro tip: cut off a little bit first and then make sure it's the right thickness before you commit and cut the rest. Unlike using the jig, getting the correct thickness is not foolproof, and I ended up cutting it too thin last time. Once again, you're welcome. When you have your strip, keep sanding it down and checking if it fits. You want to have to apply a little bit of pressure to get it in there. Ideally, when you add the glue, you won't have to add any clamps to let it set because the frame itself will be the clamp. And then, again, we'll let that set. Once it's dry, we can cut off the corners. I use the pull saw. And pro tip number, 300? I lost count. Don't pull too hard. Take your time. I tried rushing through this with my last frame and the corners ended up ripping off rather than being cut, and then I had to fix them and fill them back in. It's not too much extra work, but if you can avoid it, you should avoid it. Alright, we're getting there. We are so close. This is usually where I start getting nervous that I'm going to mess it up really, really bad and have to start all the way from the beginning. I don't even know how I would mess it up that badly, but I'm sure I could figure it out if you just left me to my own devices for long enough. Then I sanded the frame so that I can make it nice and smooth. I started out with something super aggressive, like 60 or 80 grit. I can't remember, but I just wanted to really level everything out and get rid of any burn marks or any inconsistencies that were left by the table saw. And then I dropped down the grit to 220 and then 320 to soften everything up. I also filled in some of the gaps that I left when I inserted the spline into the corners. I honestly don't know how I missed this while I was gluing. I should have been paying more attention because this should have been easy to avoid, but hey, that's not how I've done things on this channel so far, so why should I start now? Finally, after the filler dried and I sanded that bit down, I could start prepping for the finish. I use regular rubbing alcohol to wipe down my frame, and the reason I use alcohol is because it evaporates way faster than water, so it doesn't give the grain enough time to raise and undo all of the work I did while sanding. At least that's what should happen if I did it right. I poured way too much. No wonder I didn't make it as a bartender. You should pour like half of what I did, and then you'll be golden. But after I got all the sawdust off, I could finally put on the finish. This is my favorite part because it's very hard to screw it up at this point. even for me. I used wipe on poly. I really like that finish because it's easy to work with and it dries really fast, so you can put on a lot of layers without having a lot of downtime in between. I think I ended up putting on like 3 layers total, and I obviously sanded lightly between each layer just to make the finish really nice. So there is another key part to all of this, and that is the glaze. If you're making a frame that's a standard size, you can find glass or vinyl that's already pre-cut at a lot of the major hardware stores, so I'm kind of assuming that's what most people will be doing. I will be using this vinyl that we got while dumpster diving behind a store that shut down, because we're nothing if not classy over here. And because of this, I will have to put a lot of elbow grease to get all of the scratches out and make it actually usable. I feel like this is a whole process in itself, so instead of putting it in this video and making it way longer and more complicated than it needs to be, I'm actually going to make it into its own separate video. This way, it will also be easier to search for in case someone just wants to see how that part is done. So for now, let's just pretend like I have this already cut vinyl that's perfect and shiny and the right size, and I'll hopefully have that second video out in a few days after I post this one. Okay, let's throw this all together. We have the frame. We have the glaze. The picture. And some people pointed out in my last video that I should use a mat between my picture and the glaze, and they're totally right. I never use a mat. I don't know why I'm so against them. I really should. They make a huge difference. This is definitely a do as I say, not as I do situation. The mat isn't only there for aesthetic reasons, but also it creates a bit of a buffer between the glaze and the picture, and this is really important to prevent the picture from getting damaged in case of humidity. And also, if I had a mat, I wouldn't have to tape the picture down to the glaze in order to keep it in place. I really need to start doing this properly because it is such a simple step and makes a huge difference. But for now, I can at least tell you not to do it incorrectly like I'm doing it. Use a mat. Finally, I grab my glazier points. Glazier points? Glazier points. Am I saying that right? Anyways, and I secure everything in the frame. And for anyone who's cringing right now because they're watching me do this with a chisel, this is my junk chisel. Don't worry, I would never disrespect one of my good chisels like this. I was watching this clip and I thought, oof, I better explain myself before I get roasted in the comments. Alright, you ready? Here it is. This is the frame. As far as putting it up goes, you probably noticed that I didn't put anything on the back that I can then hang it from. There's a reason for this. I don't like putting nails in my walls, so I always use command strips. And I know, people give me a hard time about this all the time, but I like to move my pictures around, and if I put in a nail, now I have to patch it up after I take the picture down, and then I have to match the paint that I used for the wall, and you can't always match it exactly because the paint changes color as it's exposed to the elements, so it'll never be exactly the same, and then I start to spiral, and listen. Full respect to all of you who like to use nails, but some of us have commitment issues, so this is what we have to do. Before I hung it up, I ran it past my biggest critic to see what she thinks. Do you like my frame? Tough crowd. And then I put it up. I really like how this fits in the narrow space. I think it's really subtle, but it does also give it a nice accent. Well, that's all we got for today. Hopefully this video wasn't too long. I tried to keep it concise, but still mentioned every detail that may not be as obvious to somebody who's making this for the first time, so I hope that I covered everything that you might have questions about. Let me know what you thought about both the video and the frame, and I'll see you in the next one. And for anyone who's sticking around for the math part, don't worry, I didn't forget. Let me show you. Here we have the picture, and then the mat, and then the frame that will be going all the way around the entire thing. Let's say that the mat is 10 by 5 centimeters. An initial instinct might be to assume that you need 10 plus 10 plus 5 plus 5 centimeters of material for the frame. But this is wrong. You need to measure the outside of the frame, which is bigger than the length of the mat. How much bigger? 2 times the size of these little edges, 1 for each side. So we have to figure out what the length of those edges is, and then add that to the length of the mat. And how do we do that? Luckily, it's easy, because we're smart and we know trigonometry. First, you need to know how wide the face of the frame is. Let's say it's 2 centimeters. Second, you need to know how deep you want your rabbet to be. Let's say it's 1 centimeter. That means that we now have this triangle that has the side of 1 centimeter and an angle of 45 degrees, because that's how we cut miters for rectangular frames. So all we need is to figure out what this edge of the triangle is, and then we can add that twice to each side of our mat length. And how do we figure out this edge? Well, luckily, what we have here is a 45, 45, 90 triangle. And from trigonometry class, we know that 45, 45, 90 triangles are isosceles. So we don't even have to do any math. We just know that both of these legs are identical. So as long as you cut your miters at 45 degrees, which you always will, this will always be the case. See? That wasn't so bad. Isn't math fun? Let me know if this made sense, and good luck with your builds. Bye.